Good afternoon and welcome. This podcast is part of the Victorian Bicultural Workers Network, facilitated by CoHealth's Bicultural program. Through these conversations, bicultural workers share their community's experiences of mental health, well-being and accessing supports. These stories are shared to help mainstream services better understand the needs, strengths and perspectives of refugee and migrant communities, and to reflect on how they can work more effectively and safely alongside them. Before we begin, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and we acknowledge that this work takes place on land that was stolen. We recognise the enduring leadership, strength and wisdom of First Nations people in navigating, surviving and challenging colonial systems, and in bridging divides to support the well-being of their communities. My name is Jasmine, and I'm the Bicultural Program Lead at CoHealth. Joining me on the podcast today is Shadow Toke. Welcome, Shadow. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your work, which community you come from, and who you are?
Yeah, sure. I always find this question difficult to answer because I feel like my answers are rarely straightforward. I'll start off with my ethnicity first. I am Karen. And for anyone unfamiliar with the Karen people, we are one of the largest ethnic groups in Burma. Our homeland is known as the Karen state, and our more widely recognized neighbor is Thailand, which lies to our east. I speak Sagol Karen, one of the lesser known languages used in Australia, but it's actually one of the largest Karen language dialects. And my work is also not so simple to describe. I am an interpreter and a bicultural worker, a research assistant, and a PhD candidate working towards becoming a researcher in refugee and migrant health. All of my work revolves around serving my community, improving access to services so we can move forward from surviving to truly thriving. I think my community is one of the most resilient groups of people that you will ever meet. We come from a place where we had no recognized identity and no country claimed us as their own. And even today, many people don't know who the Karen people are unless their work or life intersects with ours. But we never really allowed the invisibility or the rejection to defeat our spirit. And instead, it strengthened our determination to define ourselves and to show the world who we are and what we have to offer. And I think that kind of grit is pretty rare to find.
I love that. That's such a beautiful description. Thank you. This podcast, we're talking about mental health and well-being and trying to develop a bit of an understanding about how different communities are talking and thinking about their mental health and accessing supports. How would you describe your community's understanding of mental health, and what kind of words or concepts exist in your language to describe it?
I would have to be upfront and say that mental health is not well understood in our Karen community and in our culture, at least not to the same interpretation and understanding as the Western world. In Karen, the word for mental health is the same word we would use for the heart, which can be confusing, especially for interpreters. The direct translation would be heart teacher, which could refer to a psychologist or therapist or even a cardiologist. So we don't know which one is which unless we ask for more and ask for a bit more clarification. And I used to say our language was underdeveloped. That's how I would often describe our language. However, someone very wise once told me that there is no such thing as an underdeveloped language because every language develops to meet the needs of its people. And that made me pause. It is true. I thought about it. We have limited vocabulary for mental health because our people, Karen people, have rarely had the luxury to stop and reflect. For generations, we have endured persecution, violence, and displacement, and we've always been on the move to survive. But we do recognize what the heart does, right? When we are worried, when we are experiencing something traumatic, our heart is shaking. And that's how we would describe it. Our heart is shaking. And this can be very well be understood or interpreted as anxiety. And so Karen people describe what is happening to them rather than focusing on the labeling. So words like anxiety or depression doesn't really exist, but we can describe what our body and mind are doing. And another way for us to describe our experiences of depression is our heart is low. And that's the literal translation, but we're talking about the heart is feeling low right now.
I'm an interpreter by background as well, and I always find it so fascinating learning about the meaning behind words. And I think it's beautiful, the description that you gave about it coming back to the heart and the feelings of the heart. But you raised something really important there as well about how for the Karen community, but I think it applies to many refugee communities, is there hasn't been time to stop and reflect on the impacts of trauma on a community's or an individual's mental health because people are operating in survival mode. It's such an important point and something we're hearing people talk about a lot on this podcast. I wanted to ask whether back home or here in Australia, once people have identified that they're struggling with their mental health and they're needing support with that, what are the practices that people use or the ways in which they seek help and support in your community?
Before I answer that question, I do have to say it's really important how you phrase the question, because you said when people recognize, that they are needing that support, because our main issue is that recognition. Because from young, our boys were taught to not cry because it is seen as a threat to their manhood, or girls are told that their problems are too small compared to what the older generations have to endure. And so we haven't been taught to let our hearts feel or our minds to seek comfort. And that's always been the message, to shut it down and move on. And as a result, we struggle to recognize when we should seek support. However, through my years of interpreting, I've seen the positive changes. And for most people, they will first go to their GP for what they would believe as a physical issue. But it's the excellent GPs, the good doctors that would recognize that the root cause is something deeper than the physical symptoms. These good doctors would recognize it and speak to their patients, the Karen people, in a way that helps them to open up a bit more, to see someone, to speak to someone about what they are experiencing, assuring them that if you speak to this person, you will feel like you'll be able to sleep again, you will improve your appetite. And it's their gentle approach to help them open up, to seek that extra support and help them realize as well, it's not just the physical experiences that they are having. Because the reason why it is important for GPs as the entry point for many Karen people in accessing mental health services is because the GPs have a built-up rapport and trusting relationship with the Karen person. So they trust this GP. They trust them, that they have good intentions for them. So when they say, go speak with this person, then they are more inclined to. Because for our community, we would rather speak to someone who we trust rather than speak to a stranger with, even if they have titles or papers to prove their qualifications, that doesn't mean anything to us. We would rather go to a church leader, a friend, or a respected community member long before speaking to a stranger.
And you mentioned before how boys and girls are told that their problems are insignificant and that their struggles are not as real as the generations before them because of their experiences of war and such extreme hardship. How do you think that narrative feeds into stigma and people's unwillingness to talk about or understand mental health, and that it's something that everybody experiences in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah. I do have to recognize that our older generations, that's how they were able to cope with what they had to experience. And what they found helpful was to suppress it, to move on, and to not dwell on it, because like we said before, they didn't have time to dwell on it. They had to keep moving on, focusing on the next life-threatening thing. So we have to be honest and say it is damaging for our younger generations to be taught these ways, but it is also the only way that our older generations know how to cope. And for majority of their life, it has worked for them. And because we don't want to talk about it, and then when we are sitting in front of a counselor, in front of a psychologist, they ask, why are you here? What brought you here? And they will say, I have no idea. I've just been told to come here. And so that reflective exercise, they've never practiced that before. So how can we expect them to open up to a stranger, first of all, and to even tap into what they are actually feeling or what they had experienced? That is very difficult. Traditionally, we would have for someone who may have to take antidepressant or to see a psychologist, we call them crazy. And that word, it just cuts like a knife in our culture. And we don't want to be associated with that. So the further we stay away from mental health services, the more sane we are, the more healthier we think we are. I would have to say that I am seeing more positive changes in changing this mindset and changing this outlook on mental health services and accessing these services at an earlier stage.
You introduced yourself at the beginning as an interpreter, and I'm interested in how, when you are discussing mental illness with a community member, is there ways to do that in your language that doesn't lead to using words that are triggering or disempowering?
Yeah, I would use words like feelings, like the heart. How's the heart feeling? And linking it to the mind. The mind carries a lot of thoughts and a lot of worries. And that's how often they would describe what they're experiencing. And I would, 99% of the time, I would lean into the words that they are already using, because those are the words that they associate with, they can relate to, and that they feel safe using as well. I don't use any technical words or any words that I think it fits better, but I would try to match their vocabulary.
It's interesting because I've spoken with other interpreters who've said it's really hard because the direct translation to, say, mental health in their language often has those negative undertones of crazy or some other derogatory term. So it's really interesting to hear how you scaffold those conversations so that the person isn't triggered or the language that's being used is empowering.
I just wanted to add that it's also important for the health professionals to be using safe words as well that may not be triggering, and adjust their language to make our job easier, but also to make sure that their client is safe.
Yeah, 100%. The other question I was going to ask is about whether or not you see changes among younger generations of Karen people growing up in Australia. Do you feel like the openness to talk about mental health is growing? Has the stigma reduced or not yet?
I think our younger generation, although they are very much integrated into Australian social circles, when they come back home, they're still having to navigate the intergenerational sort of mindset about mental health. But at school, they will say, it's okay if you feel this way. It's okay to talk about it, seek support in earlier stages. But when they come back home, they hear a different story. And so they have to navigate these two. And it's really important for parents to hear and listen to their young people. I would say that's the first thing. The second is our parent generation are accessing mental health services, right? And I think that's due to the good healthcare that we have in Australia. Attitudes are shifting and mindset is now more, I won't judge you for seeking mental health support, but if I had to seek it for myself, I would feel ashamed. And if someone from my family would have to seek mental health services, then I might be embarrassed. So this acceptance for others, but not yet for ourselves. And so I think there's still some healing to do. And for parents who are accessing the mental health services themselves, they are more open for their children to access it. But those who haven't engaged in these kind of services, they are less open and less understanding of the need for it.
When people actually do engage with a mental health service, what do you think are some of the challenges that they face in engaging?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that what I've mentioned before, people don't see the benefit of talking to a mental health professional. Their title doesn't mean much to us. And also, I think the other thing is that some professionals may not yet be equipped to work effectively with current clients. And I say this because I have interpreted for this situation where this person was referred to see a counselor because something traumatic had happened to them. And the professional just sat with them in silence and say, why are you here? Tell me what's going on. And then the person has no idea. And then the health professional doesn't really know how to engage with them, to get them to open up and to start talking. Because I think they're so used to people coming in with a problem, with something on their mind and just leading the conversation. But when it comes to current clients who've never had a conversation like this in their entire life, how can they lead such conversations?
Mm-hmm.
Second, in a different interpreting situation, which was heartbreaking for me to interpret because at the peak of this client's emotions, while they were led to revisit painful memories, and at the peak of their emotions, they were told that the session is over, that their time ran out. Imagine, Jazz, you and I, if we were to engage in a therapy session, we would get maybe 50 minutes of a session and maybe 40 minutes of actual talking time. But when someone relies on an interpreter to communicate, they may only get 15, 20 minutes if they're lucky of actual talking time. And I don't think that's equitable care. So they need that extra time to learn how to reflect safely for them. And so the earliest therapy sessions may involve silence, maybe uncertainty, because vulnerability feels unsafe with them. And also trusting in authority figures is very low due to past traumas, past experiences with authority figures. And anyone, you may say, I'm a counselor, I'm not an authority figure. You have an education. You are on the other side of the table. You have a title or status. Okay, you are seen as an authority figure. And trust has to be earned. Even in the earlier sessions, those are the sessions that you need to be building that trust and not assuming that they automatically trust you because you follow a code of conduct or you say that you will practice confidentiality. Or you need to prove that because in the past, they've had their vulnerability been taken advantage of. They've been abused by authority figures who abused their powers. And that trust was broken before they came to see you. So it's really important for health professionals to be understanding this and that there are so many challenges internally and externally for current clients.
What I'm really hearing is that the process of engaging with mental health services needs to be slowed down, that more time needs to be allocated for effective communication and allowance for interpreting, but also, especially with Karen or other refugee communities, building in time just to build trust, to build the relationship and to educate the client on what the counselling or the psychology appointment and the process is about and how it works and what their rights are and what safety and security exists for them in their disclosure and in their sharing of vulnerability. Because I hear it all the time across different communities about people being scared to disclose their mental illness or their worries because they don't know about their rights in regards to confidentiality. They're not sure what their rights are in regards to immigration, their visa status, their protection in the country, whether or not their children will be taken from them if they disclose that they're not coping emotionally, that child protection might get involved, because people are hearing all of these stories of negative experiences people have had in their communities here in Australia, but also, like you said, that lack of trust and abuse of power of authority figures back home, leading to real mistrust in the system. And I don't think that our system allows for that slowing down and that capacity building required for these community groups.
100%. And before we came to Australia, we had to do this comprehensive screening, some testing to make sure that we are healthy and fit to come here. But then it's not going to be suddenly okay for us to be unhealthy and unwell. So we're not going to feel safe if we disclose that we're feeling unwell mentally. We might get deported back. And those are the kind of fears that may be lingering and preventing people from fully disclosing.
In your view, what would the ideal mental health service look like? One where people from your community would feel safe, welcome, understood? What if we could describe utopia? What would it look like?
Let me bring you back to our homeland. Our original therapy spaces were by the stream, by the river, while working, maybe at the well, and where we are seeing other people who we can relate to, who we can exchange stories with. And I think it's important that mainstream organizations and like mental health services understand this, that the importance of community and connection and shared humanity in healing. When you mentioned utopia, I think of Next Door Psychology. So it's run by psychologist Alison, and she's wonderful. She sees a lot of clients from the communities from Burma, and she's a white Australian. People love seeing her, and she doesn't have to speak Karen in order for her Karen clients to feel safe with her. They are extending the therapy sessions, not just constrained to the rooms and the therapy rooms, but outside. They're taking the therapy sessions outside, and it's not the traditional sessions. They create crafts days, they created social groups, some English conversational classes for communities that are accessing these services. And it's recreating that environment where people are gathering to do a common activity, and where they can feel safe to share their stories, their experiences, because that other person that is hearing their story is also in the same boat. They can also relate, and they feel less alone, and they can connect with other people. And even if they are not connecting with people that speak the same language as them, the workers that are there, the health professionals that are there, they are trying to engage with them, connect with them by greeting them in Karen, even if it's imperfect.
Yeah.
That sort of effort, we really appreciate it. And also that sort of environment that we're taking people out of the synthetic, like clinical rooms. We are taking them outside in the nature where they can feel connected to land, to the earth, and they don't have the pressure to talk. There's no one sitting across from them waiting for them to speak. And I think that group therapy, even though they're not calling it group therapy, but it's working in that way, because we're in a safe space and we feel less on guard. We feel more connected to the people that we are surrounded by.
That's amazing. I actually haven't heard of Next Door Therapy before. Is it a service that's in Werribee?
Yeah, so it's called Next Door Psychology, and the psychologist that founded it is really a great person. She's really thinking out of the box to meet her clients where they are at, recognizing that it's beyond what's happening inside them that is impacting them. It's their community, it's their families back home, it's their it's the broader issues that's happening around them. And she's not only recognizing it, but beautifully integrating it into her care.
I feel like this story that you've shared, it provides some really tangible strategies that mainstream mental health services can use to build better rapport and trust among diverse communities, like stepping outside of a consulting room, integrating wellbeing programs, group sessions, programs that aren't mental health focused, but are focused on building connection and safety and peer support and shared lived experience. And I think these kinds of examples of really tangible strategies that services can use to build trust and effective care for communities. We've nearly come to the end of our conversation, but I just wanted to ask before we wrap up if there's anything that you really wanted to share on the podcast that you haven't had an opportunity to share, or any final thoughts or reflections.
I guess maybe just to speak on our role as a bicultural worker. We need collaboration with other organizations. We need to work together so that services are better informed, they are more well equipped to serve the needs of various different communities. Some of the things that I'm saying about my own Korean community are relatable to other communities of different countries, let alone communities from Burma. I think for our current communities, there's not many bicultural workers. So I think there is a gap for more of us to be trained. However, when we are in those situations where we can work with community members and the organizations, we can help community members not get lost in the system and to navigate the services safely and effectively. And health providers, the counselors, the psychologists, they may be limited to the appointment time because they have many other clients. But bicultural workers, I think there is a gap there where we can be trained to, I guess, carry on that care, to provide that continuity of care. Of course, not as a therapist. However, the emotions doesn't end when the session ends. So for us, are there any things that we need to follow up with? Is there anything that we can provide further support with? And whether we can inform the services with the client's permission for us to connect with them with additional support or to be there with them beyond the sessions. But I think with how things are at the moment, I think that is way beyond our capacity. And I think there needs to be a specialized bicultural role in the mental health care space so that they have the internal resources that they know and that they can tap into, and wouldn't feel I would be ready to work in those kind of spaces. And I would definitely need to be trained.
I think you've just identified a really significant gap in the sector at the moment, is that there are not funded roles or very limited funded roles for bicultural workers to be working in mental health services. And although we're seeing it grow, it's still a very misunderstood and not very well supported workforce that needs a lot of advocacy and wraparound support for them to be integrated effectively into mental health care.
Also, I think there needs to be more interpreters to be trained to work into these spaces, but also a safe integration of working with interpreters. So briefing them, debriefing with them, and also not always constantly changing the interpreters as well. You're adding another stranger to the conversation, and we don't know what sort of pre-existing relationships that they might have. Anyways, I think that is a whole nother conversation to be had.
I hear you though, and it's also a call to action to interpreter agencies. Having worked as an interpreter myself, like I know that you walk into all kinds of incredibly difficult conversations, yet you're working as a subcontractor, you're not provided with clinical supervision, there's often not a person to call to debrief who's an expert in interpreting themselves or understands the complexities of the types of situations that you face as an interpreter. So it is a very broad conversation that could be had around advocacy, capacity building, supports, trainings for interpreters that unfortunately there's a huge gap there. And it adds to the complexity of effective mental health service delivery, because if you don't have a well-supported interpreting community, then they're less able to create a safe therapeutic environment for people accessing services as well. So complicated. And yes, we probably need a whole nother podcast to talk about that. Look, Shadow, thank you so much for your time. It's been such an incredibly rich conversation, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared and your expertise as a bicultural worker, an interpreter, and a community member. So thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah, thank you for hosting such an amazing podcast as well. It's such great topics and conversations that you are having on the podcast.
Thanks, Shadow.